Can I use Drizzle ORM with Nest.JS framework? It's a little tricky, but I'm going to show you how you can do that step by step. We are going to refactor the Nest.js project that we have created in the previous video and integrate it with Drizzle ORM. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, I open up the previous video's project. It's a Nest.js project that has been configured with Prisma. So we are going to replace the Prisma with Drizzle ORM in this project. So the first thing we should do here is to go to the package.json file and remove the Prisma client here, and also inside the dev dependency we need to remove the Prisma here. Okay, so let's save this, and as a next step we need to install the Drizzle ORM. So here I'm going to open up the terminal and say npm I Drizzle ORM, and also whether SQLite 3, which is the Node.js driver for SQLite. So let's install these two packages. Okay, and then we need to install the Drizzle kit, which is a dev dependency. So I'm going to say npm I-d and then Drizzle kit. Okay, now we are going to create a Drizzle module for our Nest.js application. So I'm going to say here Nest.GMO, which stands for module, and then Drizzle. Okay, it will create a Drizzle module here inside the src directory, and here as you can see we have a Drizzle module, and here as you can see inside the src directory we have the app.module here, and also prisma.service.ts file which we have created in the previous video. So we don't need Prisma here, so let's remove the Prisma service here. And we are going to create a Drizzle provider inside the Drizzle module. But before doing that, let me create the schema file for the Drizzle ORM. So here inside the Drizzle directory, I'm going to create a schema.ts file. Okay, and here we need to define the user table. So here as you can see we have a Prisma directory which is from the previous project. So if I open it, and here inside the schema.prisma file, here we have a user model which has a ID, email, name, and password. Okay, so inside the schema.ts file we need to export a table that has these 4 fields. So I go back to the schema.ts file, and here I'm going to export a users table. So here I'm going to say export const users, and then set it to a SQLite table function. So here I'm going to say SQLite table, and as you can see it comes from the Drizzle ORM / SQLite core. And then we need to define a name for our table inside our SQLite database. I'm going to go ahead with the users, and then as a second argument we need to pass an object that defines the fields in our SQLite table. So the first field is the ID, which is going to be an integer, so I set it to integer function that comes from the SQLite core. Do not use the integer function that comes from the PG core. It is used for Postgres databases. So I'm going to use the integer function that comes from the SQLite core. Then as a first argument we need to define a name for our field, which is going to be ID, and then we should specify the mode of our integer field, which is going to be a number. So here I pass an object, and inside it we can specify the mode. So let's import the integer function first, and now we can have the IntelliSense for the mode. As you can see it can be a boolean, timestamp, and number. So we are going to go ahead with the number and then chain a primary key function to the integer function which set these fields as the primary key of our table. Okay, and now we can set the auto increment to true, so it will be a auto increment ID field, and when we are going to insert a new user into our users table we don't need to specify the ID for our new user. It will be assigned by the SQL database automatically. Okay, now we are going to define our next field, which is going to be a name. I'm going to set it to text function, which again comes from the SQLite core. Okay, and then we just need to set a name inside our database for this field. We're going to go ahead with the name. Okay, and then we are going to define the email field, and then set it to text function. Okay, and just set a name for this field inside our database. I'm going to go ahead with the email. Okay, and as a last field we need to define the password field, which again it is going to be a text, so I set it to text function and just set its name to password. Okay, so this will be the users table inside our SQLite database. So we are done here, and as a next step I'm going to delete the Prisma directory here because we don't need it anymore. Okay, and in the next step we need to to define a Drizzle provider for our Drizzle module. And it's just like the Prisma service that we have created in the previous video, but here we can't use a Drizzle service. We are going to create a Drizzle provider since this provider is going to be an async provider. So we should use the use factory pattern from the Nest.JS, and therefore we need to create a provider. It's just like the service, but it's a function. It's not a class. So here I'm going to create a drizzle.provider.ts file. Okay, and here I'm going to export a list here, and then therefore we can use this list inside the Drizzle module providers. So here I'm going to say export const Drizzle provider and set it to a list here, and then inside it we should define our async provider. So here I'm going to create an object here, and this object should have a provide property. So I'm going to say provide, and we should set it to a string keep. So in order to do that, here I'm going to create a constant for it. So I'm going to say export const Drizzle async provider, and then set it to just a string. It can be whatever we want. So I'm going to go ahead with the Drizzle provider. Later in this video, you can see the usage of this Drizzle async provider constant. Okay, and here you can use this constant with the provide property here. So I'm going to set it to Drizzle async provider constant, and now we can define our actual provider, which is going to be a use factory. Okay, and we are going to set it to an async function. Okay, it doesn't have any parameter, so let's get rid of the parameter here. And here the first thing we should do is to create a SQLite database. So here I'm going to say const SQLite and set it to a new instance of the database class. So I'm going to say new database, and now let's import the database from the Better SQLite module. So here I'm going to say import database from Better SQLite 3, but importing the database class from the SQLite 3 will give us an error in the runtime. I will show you how I can fix this with a simple trick. So now let's go ahead just like this, and here inside the database we should set the path of our actual SQLite database. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create a variable inside our env file. You can see it has a database URL. It's for the Prisma client. So let's remove that and just go with the SQLite.db. Okay, so it will create a SQLite.db file in the root path of our project. So let's save this and get back to our Drizzle provider here and pass the env variable inside our SQLite database class. So here I'm going to say process.env.database URL. Okay, and we have an error here, and that's because we misspelled the database class. So let's fix that. Okay, and we are good to go. And as a next step, we need to create the DB client for Drizzle ORM from the SQLite database. So here I'm going to say const db and set it to Drizzle function, and let's import the Drizzle function from the Drizzle ORM / Better SQLite 3. And now here we can pass the SQLite database that we have created in the previous line. So I'm going to pass the SQLite, and then as a second argument we need to pass our schema. It is really important if we want to use db.query. So now let's import our schema and pass it to this Drizzle function. So here I'm going to say import everything as schema from the schema.ts file. Okay, and now we can pass it to the Drizzle function. So here I'm going to pass an option object, and here just pass the schema. Okay, and now all we need to do is to return this DB client from the use factory function. So here I just return the DB. Okay, so now let's close this off, and after the use factory function we just need to provide an export list and set the Drizzle async provider inside it. Okay, now we can use this provider inside our Drizzle module. So here I go to the Drizzle module, and here in the module decorator we need to specify the providers and set it to a list here, and then we just spread the Drizzle provider that we have defined in the drizzle.provider.ts file. Okay, so we are good to go, and now we can use the Drizzle provider in order to be able to access to the Drizzle DB client. So here inside the user module, as you can see in the user service, we have used the Prisma service, and with the Prisma service, we have had access to the database. So now let's remove the Prisma service here. Okay, we need to inject the Drizzle provider inside our user service in order to be able to use the Drizzle DB client. So now let's remove this Prisma service, and now we can inject the Drizzle provider into this service. So since it's a async provider and we have used the use factory in order to create that provider, we need to inject it with the @inject decorator. So I'm going to use @inject here. Okay, it comes from the Nest.js/common, as you can see here, and then we should specify the name, the string name of our Drizzle provider. So as you remember here, we stored the name of our provider inside a constant named Drizzle async provider. Now we can use this in order to inject this provider into the user service. So here we just need to use the Drizzle async provider, and now we can have private DB. And since it's a SQLite database with the Better SQLite 3 driver, we need to set its type to the Better SQLite 3 database. And then in the generic, we should pass the type of our schema file. So here, let's import the schema. I'm going to say import everything as schema from the src, and then Drizzle, and then schema file. Okay. And here with the Better SQLite 3 database, we should pass the type of the schema file in the generic type of the Better SQLite 3 database. Okay, so now we can use this DB client in our user service in order to do CRUD operation with our SQLite database. So here, as you can see, we have a create function which uses the Prisma client to create a user inside our database. So as a first step, it checks inside our database if any user is existed with the new user's email. It just checks if the email of the user is duplicated or not inside our database. So let's comment this out and let's write this CRUD operation with our Drizzle ORM DB. So here I'm going to say const user and set it to await this .db.query. Okay, and then we have users, and then find first, and then we just pass the option object. We specify the where API and set it to EQ function, which comes from the Drizzle ORM, and specify the field that we want to put this equality filter on it. So I'm going to use it on the users.email. Here I'm going to specify the users.email, and as a second argument we pass the DTO.email. So this retrieve the user with this DTO.email inside our user table, and here we check if the user is not undefined. It means that the email of the user is duplicated, and we just throw in conflict exception with the email duplicated. And then here we insert a new user into our database with the Prisma. Of course, we need to comment this out and write our insert statement with the Drizzle ORM. So here I'm going to say const new users, okay, and set it to this.db. Of course, we need to put the await keyword before it because it's a async operation, and then say this.db.insert, okay, and then chain the values function, okay, and now we specify the table that we are going to insert data into it. It's the users table, and then we chain the values function, and inside it we should specify the values for our new user, and we just spread the DTO object which contains the name, email, and the password of the new user. And here we just need to hash the password with the bcrypt library. So I'm going to set the password to the hash function from the bcrypt library. Okay, we have already imported it, and as you can see, the hash function is come from the bcrypt library. Okay, and we put the DTO.password here, and then put the number of the salt rounds, which is going to be 10, its recommended value. And then we just need to chain the returning function. So this statement will insert a user record inside the users table with this data, and then just just fetch it and return it inside a list called new users. Okay, so here we need to extract the password out of the new user. So it's a list and we should set its index as 0 because we are going to just insert one user inside our database. So this new users list will contain just one user. Okay, so we have refactor this function, create function, and use the Drizzle ORM instead of the Prisma. And let's go and refactor the next function, which is the find by email function. You just use the Prisma client and find unique function. So let's comment this out and let's rewrite it with the Drizzle ORM client. So here we just return await this.db.query.users.find first, and then pass the option object and specify the where API, and just use the EQ function and set the field that we are going to put the filter on, which is going to be users.email, and then pass the value, which is going to be this email parameter from the find by email function. And yeah, that's it. It will find the users inside our users table that their email is equal to this email parameter. And let's go to refactor the next function, which is the find by ID, and let's comment this statement which uses the Prisma client. Okay, and let's use the Drizzle ORM instead. Return await this.db.query.users.find first, pass the option object, specify the where, which is going to be a EQ function, and set the field, which is going to be users.id. Okay, and set its value to this ID parameter that we've got from the parameters of the find by ID function. Okay, and I think we're good to go. And we just need to register the Drizzle provider inside the user module because we use this inside our users module. So let's remove this and also remove the Prisma service here inside the providers list, and instead we just spread the Drizzle provider, which is imported from the drizzle.provider file, this file that is inside our Drizzle module. Okay, and now let's run our project. So here I'm going to say npm run start dev. It will gives us an error. Here we use the Prisma service inside the app module. So let's remove that. Okay, and here just remove that. So let's save this. Here we use the Prisma service inside the auth module, and let's remove it from the providers list inside the auth module, and instead we should spread the Drizzle provider. Okay, and let's save this. And here we've got the error that I've talked about earlier in this video, and that's because here inside our Drizzle provider we use the database class from the SQLite 3. Here, as you can see, we import the database class. It's not working like that. We should import everything from the better SQLite 3 as database. Okay, so let's save this. And now, as you can see, our application is running without any error. So before testing our application, here as you can see inside the drizzle.provider.ts file, we use the Drizzle function to create our Drizzle ORM DB client from the SQLite database that we have created in the previous line, and then we specify our schema. If you don't specify the schema here inside the user service, you can't use the db.query. And if you use the db.query.users, it will give us a undefined error. So in order to avoid this error, anywhere that you are creating your Drizzle ORM client with the Drizzle function, you should specify your schema, and this will fix the problem. Okay, and let's test our application. As you can see, our application is running without any error. So let's open up the Insomnia client to test this application. Okay, here as you can see, we are going to create a user. So let's remove the history here. It's from the previous project. And as you can see, we are going to create a user which sends a request to the Nest.js server /auth/register API. So if I go back here inside the auth module, we have a auth controller, and you can see it has a register API, which is a post request, and then it calls the user service.create function, the create function that we have refactored and use the Drizzle ORM client to insert a new user inside our database. So let's test it. I go back to Insomnia, and here let's call the register API with this body object. It has a name, email, and password. So let's send it, and we've got an internal error. So let's get back to our application and see. Oh yeah, we didn't run a migration in order to create our SQLite database. So let's stop our server, and in the root layout of our application, I'm going to create a file called drizzle.config.ts file. So here I'm going to say drizzle.config.ts, and inside it, first we need to import the config type from the Drizzle kit, and then we should export default an object which contains our Drizzle kit configurations file. So in order to speed up the process, let's copy them and paste it here. It has a schema property which is the path to our schema file, and then the app directory which will create the migrations inside it, which is going to be /drizzle in the root path of our project, and then we specify the driver which is the Better SQLite, and we have a DB credentials, and inside it we should specify the URL of our database which is the path of our database. So we use the process.env.database URL. And one thing you should remember here is that if you are going to read any variable from your env file inside the Nest.js project, you should install the config module from the Nest.js. For more information, you can see my previous video. Okay, so if you don't install the config module, the process.env.database URL always return the undefined value. Okay, so let's save this, and here I'm going to say npx drizzle-kit and then generate SQLite. Okay, so it will create the migrations file for us, and as you can see, it creates the drizzle directory and create a migration file here, and here we need to push this migration into our database. So here I'm going to say npx drizzle-kit, and instead of generate here, we should use the push keyword. Okay, it gives us an error, and that's because here our config file can't access to the process.env.variables. It seems that the config module only works inside your modules, and here for now just specify the SQLite.db, which is the path of our physical SQLite database. So now let's run this command to see if it works or not. Okay, as you can see, it works fine, and as I said, it seems that the config module doesn't work outside our modules. So if you guys have a solution for accessing the env variables outside our modules in the Nest.js project, just let me know in the comments section. Okay, now let's run our application again. npm run start :dev. Okay, so let's get back to our Insomnia client and send the post request to the /auth/register API. Okay, it will create a user, and the ID of the new user is 1, and let's create another user with the same email. As you can see, it will send a error message to us. The message is email duplicated, so let's change the email. I'm going to go ahead with the Sakura2 and send the request, and you can see it creates the second user with the ID of 2. So as you can see, the Drizzle ORM is working without any error in this project, and let's send a login API to our /auth/login. We used sakura2@gmail.com, the second user that we've just inserted into our database, and let's send the request. And as you can see, it works without any error. It's returned the user object which has the name of the user, email, ID of the user, and also it has the backend tokens which contains the access token and also the refresh token and expire in time of the access token. Okay, so now let me just recap what we have done in this video. First, we removed the Prisma client and Prisma directory here. Then we install the Drizzle ORM, Drizzle kit, and also the Better SQLite 3 driver, which is a Node.js driver for SQLite. And then we have created the Drizzle module, and inside it we have created the schema file which contains the user table, and then we have created the drizzle.provider, and it's a list that has an object, and this object has a provide, a use factory function, which is a async function that creates our Drizzle ORM DB client and just return it from this use factory function, and here inside the Drizzle module we register this provider, and then in the user module, actually in the user service, we have injected the Drizzle ORM DB client. With this command we use the inject decorator and pass the Drizzle async provider, which we have defined in the drizzle.provider file, and define a DB which is going to be Better SQLite 3 database, and then pass the type of our schema file as the generic in the Better SQLite 3 database, and then we can use the this.db to have access to the Drizzle ORM DB client. So yeah, that's it with this video. We have successfully integrated the Drizzle ORM with a Nest.js project, and please support me with subscribing to my channel, and if you have any idea about the next video's topic, please let me know in the comment section below. Have a nice time. Bye bye.